You are tuned in to Hawthorn University's Holistic Health and Nutrition webinar series, and I sure want to thank you for joining us as we welcome health and fitness coach and author Traci D Mitchell for her presentation on diet, hormonal weight gain, and fat distribution. Traci, it's just so great to have you with us and presenting for Hawthorn University.
Thank you, Paula. It's a pleasure to be presenting, and I'm very excited to get down to the nitty-gritty of what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, it's such an important and really timely topic in many ways. So I want to tell the audience a little bit more about you. I want to let them know that you're a graduate of Hawthorn University in 2015 and are an expert in the field of health and fitness. Traci works with people all over the world, helping them improve their health by reaching a more optimal weight through individualized diet and fitness coaching. She's the author of the national bestseller, The Belly Burn Plan, and she's been a guest on the Today Show, Steve Harvey, Dr. Oz, and has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, Oprah.com, Shape Magazine, and local media outlets throughout her hometown of Chicago. Surprisingly, she's a homebody at heart, and if you want to find Traci, she's likely in her home office taking Zoom calls with clients, working on a recipe in her kitchen, or spending time with her husband and 3 kids. And regarding her presentation today, many of us may know that hormones play a role in weight gain, but how do hormones affect body-specific fat distribution? And more importantly, how does diet play a role in regulating these hormones to reduce unhealthy fat? Well, today, Traci will get to the heart of the hormonal weight gain and demonstrate the need for individualized nutrition through the concept of eating right for your body type. And while we don't want you to miss a thing, I want you to let you know that we're recording this presentation and it'll be available for replay on our website in just a few days. You'll find it under archived webinars with years of additional ones there for you to peruse as well. And we'll likely go about 75 minutes today for the presentation. We'll follow that with your questions. And so please just write your questions or any comments that you have in the webinar question panel. Do that at any time and do it early, and we'll certainly respond during the Q&A session. I'm your host, Paula Bartholomew, one of the founders of Hawthorn, and now it's time for Traci D Mitchell. Well, once again, Traci, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. I'm so eager to learn from your expertise and hear how you'll support us all to be able to understand and then actually incorporate this information. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me again, Paula. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to get this information out there. When it comes to diet, when it comes to hormones, when it comes to weight gain, when it comes to fat distribution, when it comes to all of these things, there's a lot of information out there, and it's kind of like this big spider web of things that we need to try to understand and interpret as best as we can for our own bodies, and how to make sense of it if we experience any fluctuations throughout our lives, which inevitably, I don't know a single person that has not. How do we manage this? What do we do to best control it, to keep our bodies as healthy as possible? And that's going to be the real focus, is like bringing us back to health, discovering what balance is, and of course balance is a very unique thing for everyone's body, and really trying to understand what we can do to keep our body as fine-tuned as possible, and then react when things come up that may take our body out of its normal state of whatever it is, whether it's weight gain, whether it's the migration of fats to a different part of our body, whether it's a response to a food that we haven't had before that we're suddenly having. What can we do, and how can we stay best informed to this? So there's going to be a lot of information in today's presentation. It is going to cover a lot of bases, but we're really going to be talking about body fat, different types of body fat. We're going to be talking about different hormones, not all the hormones, but we're going to be talking about very specific big hitter hormones that play huge roles in the way our body responds, not just to what we eat, but also other cofactors that are happening in our life. And of course that coincides with weight gain, weight loss too, but typically these days we are dealing with a lot of weight gain and fat distribution. All right, so first things first, let's talk a little bit about body fat. What is body fat? Certainly our bodies are not intended to be fat-free. Body fat is a very important thing for our bodies. We need body fat. We just don't need as much as most of us have on our bodies right now. And body fat isn't just one thing. There's not just one type of body fat. There are many types of body fat. And so what I would like to do is really just break down what these different types of body fat are. You know, when it comes to fat, one of the things that I really want to stress is today, what we're looking at is we're looking at a population, at least in the United States of America, where we have obesity levels that are over 42%. And that's up from 39-ish% just a few years earlier and a few years before. And, you know, that may not sound like a big leap, but going from 39 to 42, where are we going in the next couple of years, and what can we do to try to really mitigate that? And, you know, that doesn't even include, those are adult numbers, 42.4% to be specific. And that doesn't include the 18.5% of children and adolescents that are being affected by obesity. So it's really, you know, it's really a problem. And overall, and we're talking just obesity, we're not just talking about people who are overweight, that does also affect our health. And that's approximately 71% of the population. So you see, like, this is a real problem that we have in the United States here, and we really need to try to get our arms around it as much as possible. And so we're looking at a few different types of fat. Now I'm going to skim over one type of fat pretty quickly. I'll talk about it a little bit, but it's called brown fat. Now, if you've heard of beige fat or bright fat, for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. So that's one type of fat that we do have on our body. Another type of fat is subcutaneous fat. And subcutaneous fat is really the type of fat that we have just beneath our skin, subcutaneous fat. And then we have visceral fat. And visceral fat is the fat that I think all of us really need to pay very close attention to, really listen to our bodies to discover or to learn more about whether or not we have a lot of visceral fat. And if we are developing visceral fat, what can we do to try to rid our bodies of this visceral fat? It's a harmful fat, but good news, I have very good news for everyone. Visceral fat is not the hardest thing to shake, and I'm going to explain that to you in just a little bit. But first, let's talk a little bit about brown fat, okay? Brown fat is very good for us. We want brown fat. In fact, when we're born, babies have about 5% of their body weight comes from brown fat. So, you know, it's something that is thermic. It really helps to keep our body warm. It's activated by cold. So if you want to really activate your brown fat for you, you can stand out in weather that is anywhere 66 degrees or below. That should activate your brown fat on your body. Like I said, babies do have a little bit more of it. We used to think that adults didn't have any. We thought that we kind of outgrew our brown fat, and all we were left with was our adipose tissue, including visceral fat. But it turns out that we do have a little bit of brown fat, and it's really valuable to us. You know, brown fat is a very interesting fat. It is actually brown, and brown fat gets its color from iron that's within each cell, as well as blood vessels. And the reason that brown fat is so important is because it's a mitochondria powerhouse. So it's got that iron in it. It's very energizing. It helps with metabolism. It helps with fat and carbohydrate metabolism. So even though we only have, let's say, roughly 3% brown fat on our bodies, it's very beneficial for us, and it can really, really go a long way for us. But then we switch gears and we go to subcutaneous fat. Now, no doubt, all of us need subcutaneous fat on our body. If you want to, like, air quote this, quote unquote normal, if we were all like normal-bodied people, men would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 25% subcutaneous fat. That would be considered a healthy amount. Women would have somewhere between 15 and 30% subcutaneous fat, and that too would be considered a healthy amount. Now, women naturally will carry more subcutaneous fat on their body for reproductive purposes, and largely for reproductive purposes and other physiological reasons. And you know, the thing is, like, we used to think that subcutaneous fat was just this inert fat that sat around our body looking unsightly and nobody wanted to deal with it. But it turns out fat cells are not even close to lazy. Not even close to lazy. They're the largest energy reserve in our body, and they actually do produce hormones. So they're an endocrine powerhouse located just underneath the skin throughout your body. These fat cells, obviously they insulate us. They store energy, I think, which we know, right? We know that they store energy. They're there to be burned. That energy is there to be burned. And they also produce hormones. We're going to get into those hormones in just a little bit. And they also store triglycerides, and they release fatty acids. So all of that is really important for us. Again, some is really good. Too much is more of a nuisance than anything, and I'm going to get to that. It's not good to have a preponderance of subcutaneous fat, but it's not as bad as the next player that we're going to talk about, which is visceral fat. So visceral fat. I think all of us are familiar with the term visceral fat. If you're listening right now and you're a practitioner, I'm sure that you're absolutely familiar with visceral fat and what it's done with your clients or your patients, but this is this intra-abdominal fat. It is exclusively through the gut area. It's not, our stomachs sit pretty high up in our midsection. It actually is the entire midsection area. So it doesn't necessarily look like the picture that you're seeing here. You can be normal weight and have a lot of visceral fat. You can be quote unquote skinny fat. You can also, in most cases, people that have a lot of visceral fat are not in the normal weight category. They do tend to carry a lot of this, and it really stresses out our organs a lot. Think of all the organs that we have through our midsection. You've got your spleen, you've got your heart, you've got your kidneys, you've got your intestines. Think of all your liver is so valuable. Think of all the stress that these organs are under by the pressure, physical pressure, as well as other pressures that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, that this visceral fat places on it. So visceral fat is one of these fats that makes cytokines, which in turn create low-level inflammation. Now, low-level inflammation isn't something that we can just discard because we hear that it's low level. Low-level inflammation also equates to chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation is something that we need to really be aware of. So not only does it create this C-reactive protein that I've got here, but it also creates another protein called RBP4, retinol binding protein 4, which increases insulin sensitivity as well. So here we've got a double bang for our buck with visceral fat, or should I say a triple bang, right? We've got the stress on our organs, we've got the increase in C-reactive protein, which is a marker for inflammation, and then we've got this retinol binding protein 4, which increases insulin sensitivity, or I should say decreases insulin sensitivity, which is something that is not a good thing. We want to see an increase in insulin sensitivity. So you've got all of these things at play here. Obviously, we know that visceral fat is mostly associated with obesity, but there's one way of knowing whether or not you have too much going on through your midsection area. Visceral fat also, just a good way to distinguish, in case you're wondering, the difference between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat through the belly area, for lack of a better term, is if you can pinch it. So if you can pinch it between your fingers, it's likely subcutaneous fat. So a lot of women will see this, a lot of men will see this through like love handles, places like that. We're not talking about visceral fat there. Sure, that's a nuisance, that might even be too much in those areas, but that's subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is packed deeply inside of your belly area, and this is what's causing all the problems. So this is what we're going to really be focusing on, how these hormones kind of play together with the different types of fat on our body, and then what can we do to control our hormones, at least the big players that are hormones, into getting our body to cooperate with us to offset some of this additional fat that we have, to make our bodies healthier, to make our bodies happier, to create less of a stressful environment for our body's physiology, all of that stuff. So right now, let's just look at healthy weight gain, weight loss, and diet. And I use the word diet as a healthy way of eating, purely a healthy way of eating, not a calorie counting way of eating, not a fad diet. You won't see the word fad before diet in nearly anything I write unless I'm discussing the topic. But an optimal weight is made possible through the ability to maintain an appropriate energy balance while managing an ever-shifting hormonal influence. And all of us are subjected to this ever-shifting hormonal influence. We often associate hormones with sex hormones and things like that. We associate them with times of our lives, especially if you're a woman through menopause, if you are a woman who's going through pregnancy or a menstrual cycle. A lot of this leans toward the females that we have these associations, but I assure you that hormones affect us all, men and women, greatly, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that. But let's focus on the word appropriate. So what does the word appropriate energy balance mean? Appropriate energy balance really depends on a lot of different factors. So one size does not fit all when it comes to energy intake. And an energy intake, let's just translate this to a general caloric intake. How much should you really be eating? What's right for you? Well, a lot of this is going to depend on your age. Younger people generally have a inherently faster metabolism. Certainly a 15-year-old teenage boy is going to have a faster, be able to break down foods a lot faster and use them a lot more readily than a 65-year-old man. Height will play a role. Generally speaking, taller people will have a greater energy need than shorter people. Frame. So here we're talking about, are you an ectomorph? Are you, which is a very small bone frame? Are you a mesomorph, which would be more of an athletic frame? So we're just talking about the skeleton size, right? Or are you an endomorph? So somebody with a larger bone structure. Gender, this plays a role, obviously. Men typically need a little bit more energy than the same size counterpart woman. Activity level will inherently increase our resting metabolic rate and therefore increase the need for appropriate energy intake. Lifestyle, I can't stress this enough. Lifestyle plays a huge factor. Everything from how well we sleep, how much sleep you get, how you manage your stress, the use of alcohol and or drugs. All of these things that play into what we call our lifestyle. Work goes into that too. Are you working 40 hours a week? Are you working 60 hours a week? Are you sitting at your desk all day? Are you up and you active? All of these things play a role in what would be considered an appropriate energy intake. Diet naturally will affect this. And we're going to really hone in on this in just a moment. But diet really plays a huge role in what our energy intake should be. And we oftentimes make a lot of mistakes with assuming that if we only eat the minimal amount of energy just to push off hunger, just that much throughout the day, we will lose weight, right? So if we creep down to and I've seen people do this, a 500 or 600 or 700 calorie diet, just for the sake of losing weight, not for any medical condition, not under medical supervision or anything, but just for that reason, they will inherently have a rebounding weight gain. And I will explain that in a little bit, but it's a mistake that a lot of people make by crash dieting and having an effect or making effects on your diet that have consequences down the road. And now I really don't want to focus on calories, but it's one of these things that is just important to understand what your baseline is. But a diet is so much more than just calories in, calories out. And here you have this graphic here of a few cookies and which don't nutrient-wise aren't necessarily a hotbed of nutrition, and then you're juxtaposed there with a handful of berries, and those berries are generally considered highly nutritious. Is one better than the other? Well, in my opinion, you bet. But let's say, just for argument's sake, that each handful contains the same amount of calories. So it goes to this calories in, calories out argument that if your caloric intake should be at 1,500 calories, it doesn't matter what you eat as long as you're at 1,500 calories. I think that is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they eat, even though it may work in the short term, whether it's a week or 2 weeks. You won't feel great if you're not eating as nutrient dense, but you may see weight loss, and oftentimes that's overvalued for how we actually feel. And the long-term consequences of eating foods that are not as nutrient dense is far worse than most of us really realize, because of the cascading hormonal effects that it has on our body. That is also an optimal way of eating that consists of a balance of nutrients that our body needs, and it's very specific based on each of our lives factors. So there's a lot that's going on in each of our lives that we really need to consider. Again, this goes back to the different what is our activity level, what is our stress level, what is our sleep level, what are these outside influences that are dictating what our nutrients need to be for our body. But today we have this diet culture that we live in. You know, we spend a lot of time diet hopping, and very, very conservative measures say that most people try one new diet per year. So one new diet per year per person. And then there are also estimates that suggest that it's much more than that. Something something extrapolated around like 1.5 to 2 diets per year, which is an incredible amount of stress that you put on your body, especially if those fad diets are crash diets or if they're extreme diets, which can really be very detrimental to your health. You know, we oftentimes place a lot of emphasis on weight loss or getting skinny rather than taking the slow and steady route and getting healthy and really turning our bodies around. And then in my practice, you know, I've had clients that have come to me and they have been exercising to burn calories through, you know, they come to me through some program that they've grandfathered into the way that we work together, where they feel that they need to exercise to burn calories to be able to eat that piece of cake when they go to that wedding, or to exercise to burn calories so that they are at XYZ calories throughout the day, and that way they don't have to worry about the scale going up the next morning. So it's not really a nice way to live. You know, we really fear weight gain. A lot of us, many of us, fear jumping on the scale and seeing that the scale's gone up a pound or two. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important to be at a healthy weight range, and I think that's something that should be observed, but it's not the only metric. You know, looking at different things like waist circumference, for example, overall body fat, considering different things like inflammation, and, you know, what's triggering the need to diet in the first place. So there are a lot of different things that we need to consider there. You know, our ideals are perceived through outside influences, you know, whether it's social media, whether it's a magazine, whether it's some influencer that's out there telling us what to look like, what to feel like. But our beliefs have been ingrained through old research. And so what I want to jump to right now, as we start kind of moving toward the more scientific side of things, is what research tells us, what this new research really tells us. Now, going back to subcutaneous fat, we used to think that adipose tissue, subcutaneous fat, was inert. We thought that it just sat around. And, you know, we thought that it was just a storage vessel for fat. And don't get me wrong, it's not as wonderful as brown fat is, but it is definitely an endocrine organ. It's capable of secreting hormones, and it also can modulate inflammation. So it can be actually very useful for us. As I mentioned, we do need a good amount of subcutaneous fat in our body for a number of reasons. But this is just interesting that over the last couple of decades, we've really discovered a lot about subcutaneous fat. We used to think also, and this doesn't go back too far, maybe 5-6 decades, that a one-size-fits-all or more of an allopathic diet was appropriate for everyone. So here we get on the fad diet bandwagon, and I always go back to the 1950s for when I want to really dig down into where these awful diets started. Then I go back to the 1950s, and then you move forward a little bit to the, you know, the advent of diet sodas and how calories were, so much value was placed on a lack of calories. And we used to think that, you know, this finite box of like, this is what everyone should be eating. And, you know, we have our USDA food plate that we have, and it tells us this is the dictate, this is the mandate, this is what everyone should be eating, this is what's appropriate for everyone. But now we know that specific nutrient requirements are needed very often for specific people, and there's just no way around it. And it comes down to not just macronutrients, your protein, carbohydrate, and fat, or how much of those you should be taking in, but also your micronutrients. So, you know, we'll be able to dive into that a little bit more as well. So now let's talk a little bit more about hormones. You know, what on earth is going on with our hormones, and how responsible are our hormones for weight gain, fat distribution, and how can our diet help our hormones be in a better place and find homeostasis, which is a key word that I will be coming back to in just a few minutes. But our hormones play a major role in what creates our body's individual biochemistry. It makes us really unique from someone else. It's what I call my kids, like they're their own special little snowflakes. And I think it's something that's really important that we all recognize, that you're very different from your spouse. Your needs are going to be very different from your sister, your mother, your neighbor, your friends. And it's going to be based on a lot of different things like diet. What is your diet? Is your diet a little bit unique? Do you crave certain things? Do you eat certain things? Do you not prefer to eat certain things? Do you have allergies? What is your age? Are you someone that is, at the height of their youth? Are you someone that is just becoming an adult at 18 to 25 years of age where you have a really enhanced metabolism? Or are you someone that is on the other side of menopause right now where your hormones are shifting but still very active? Are you getting enough sleep? And I will come back to this again and again and again. Sleep, in my opinion, is like food. Are you getting enough sleep? Is sleep definitely helping you, or is it hindering you? Or I should say lack of sleep hindering you. What about your stress levels? Is that affecting you at all? And there are a lot of hormones that actually are affected by this. What is your activity level or your lack of activity level? Are you making the most of your downtime? What medications are you on? Medications do have effects on people's bodies. What medications are you on? And consider and be graceful about the effects that they may have on your body. And once you do that, consider what can you do to take control of your body at that point. Do you have any functional disorders? So type 1 diabetes, for example. If you have a functional disorder like type 1 diabetes, well, then we know that insulin is going to be definitely a game changer here for you. And going back to medications, having to take, most likely in most cases, but not everyone takes this, but a synthetic insulin is going to be what will be necessary there. So there are a lot of things that play into our hormones and what makes things change so much for us. And I will say that age is one of those things that it really does change. Like we change. And we're going to be talking about exactly how those changes happen. And we're going to be talking about the big players in the hormonal world. So we got a lot going on here. Hormones, what are they? What do they do? They're really just chemical messengers, okay? They talk to our body. They talk to all parts of our body. I have here that they drive growth, they drive hunger, they drive desire, temperature, metabolism. They also play a big role in fertility, in sleep, in mood. Hormones also help to regulate your heart. Human body, we have dozens of hormones. I'm going to focus on just a few that I'm going to get to. We're going to talk about insulin. We're going to talk about cortisol, estrogen, thyroid, the relationship between leptin and ghrelin, exactly what those are if you're not familiar, and growth hormone. Now, the key word here that I talked about just a moment ago is that all hormones sit in homeostasis to one another. So just imagine for a moment that you are on a train and your train is going down a straight track and somebody removes a track off the train. So your train is going to continue going straight down this track, but one of the tracks down, let's say a mile, has been moved off. So eventually you're going to hit that point where there's no track there. There's an absence of a track. And what's going to happen to the train? The train's going to jolt. The train's going to move in a different way. It might go off the tracks. I don't know. It depends how fast the train was going. It depends how many people were probably on the train. All of these things are factors in it. But that train is going to be thrown off. So homeostasis is, imagine like just that train's just going to keep moving forward until something causes it to move in a different direction. So all of our hormones sit in the state of homeostasis. It's almost impossible to affect one hormone without there being a cascading effect in some way, shape, or form, as negligible as possible, on another hormone. Now, not all hormones, when you mess with one hormone, whether it's in most cases it's going to be inadvertently, but when you mess with one hormone, and we all do this, you're most likely going to have an effect on another hormone that is closely related to it, or on a cellular level also has receptors for it. And so these are the things that we really need to keep in mind. So in your mind, what I just want you to remember is that all hormones sit in homeostasis. If we could all just keep this in the back of our mind, it would probably help us out in understanding why, when we don't get enough sleep at night, why is it that we might wake up hungry? Or why is it that after you start transitioning through menopause, why is it that fat tends to migrate north and not stay around the hips and thighs? So we're going to go into a little bit more detail on these, and hopefully you will be walking away with some really good information. So we're going to start with insulin. Insulin's a really important hormone. I know we all know this. If you have type 1 diabetes, you are so familiar with how important insulin is for you. If you have type 2 diabetes and you've been affected by this already, you also know insulin is released by the pancreas. So obviously, it regulates blood sugar levels. It helps the cells take in glucose. Okay, so this is what insulin does. But it also is a great fat storage hormone. We know this. So, we know that prolonged insulin release triggers a fight or flight response. So here what I mentioned before is like it's impossible to have an effect on one hormone without really having an effect on another. So usually when we release insulin, when it's too high or too much of a release, we trigger cortisol to come into action. So this is an analogy that I use with my children, but I think it's also important, and it's an easy way for adults to really get their arms around too how important the role of insulin is in our body. Imagine that you eat something, let's say you eat something too much. Let's say it's, I'm gonna exaggerate here, and let's say you're sitting down and you're just gonna eat a half gallon of ice cream. You just really want this ice cream. You've just taken in an awful lot of sugar, right? So what's gonna happen is your blood sugar levels are going to rise like a hot air balloon. It's going to go up to the sky, and it's just going to keep going and going and going, and it's going to flood your blood with sugar. Okay, but what you need is for insulin to come in, and you need to let insulin know to your cells, you need to take in this glucose that's floating around here. So insulin's going to come in and act like an anchor on that hot air balloon that's flying away, and it's going to pull it down. It's going to pull it right down. And the more sugar that you've just unleashed into your body, the faster that insulin is going to go into action and pull it right down. But here's the thing, is that our pancreases at some point stop responding to this, which is what leads to type 2 diabetes in the first place. Now, insulin stores fat, but it also stops fat from breaking down. Okay, so like once you kind of get on this cycle of having too much body fat, it really creates this vicious circle. And we're going to talk about this with a couple of other hormones called leptin and ghrelin in just a moment. But what we find is people who tend to call on this insulin response a lot, who are requiring insulin to come into action far too often, far too much, that what happens is this leads to an apple-shaped body. Okay, so that apple-shaped body would be someone, and we'll go through this again in just a moment, but an apple-shaped body would be someone that carries a majority of their weight through their midsection. It's pretty straightforward. You have an apple-shaped body. If you carry it right through your belly area, it might be a little bit on your hips and thighs, but a preponderance of it will be through your belly area. And it's usually first on the boat, last off. So you, of course, can distribute fat to other parts of your body, but a vast majority of it will be through the belly area. And, it will also be visceral fat as well as subcutaneous fat. And so this is, this is what happens when we release when insulin gets called into action too much and at too high of levels. And earlier, I just mentioned the role of cortisol, that when insulin gets called into action too much and too high, cortisol gets called in to put out the fire, right? Cortisol gets called in when there is that fight or flight response. Cortisol is actually a really good hormone. We need hormones. We need cortisol. Cortisol is a very complex hormone. We have receptors for cortisol throughout most of our cells. So it inherently is affected by other hormones that have receptors in those same cells. But normal levels of cortisol really help us out a lot. It helps us manage stress, control blood sugar levels, helps us reduce infections. Long-term release, however, on the flip side, let's say you're chronically releasing excessive cortisol. Long-term release leads to a fight or flight response. The body is flooded with glucose again. So that makes sense, right? So let's give another extreme example. Let's say you go camping over the weekend and you walk out of your tent and there is a big bear standing in front of you. What do? Actually, I don't know exactly what to do, and I need to know this, but I think the reaction, let's say it's a lion, I think most of us would want to run, right? I think that would be the reaction. My reaction would not naturally be to fight the animal. My reaction would be to get out of there, to leg it out of there. But in order to make that happen, our body needs to act very quickly. So our blood that was shunted to our stomach will now move to our extremities. We need more energy. So then cortisol is like, hey, I'm going to release all this glucose to your cells so that way you have a lot of energy you can use right now. And it's going to make our bodies, it's going to put our bodies into that fight or flight situation. So that's exactly how that works. When cortisol gets released at high levels or too long, insulin's inhibited. So if insulin's inhibited, that means that free-flying glucose that's all around our cells, or the blood sugar levels that we have, like we have too much sugar through our cells, too much in our blood, they don't really have a place to go because insulin's inhibited. And insulin, remember, is that hormone that knocks on the door of the cells that say, hey, can you take in some glucose here? The glucose is waiting to come in. Please let it in. It's not available. It's inhibited. So there we have a problem with an excessive amount of blood sugar that's left in our system. And then prolonged stress is often a contributing factor to an HPA dysfunction. And now an HPA dysfunction is a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, so again, go back to the word homeostasis. I'll say that again. HPA is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So what this means is this is how you get cortisol in the first place. Signals from your hypothalamus release corticotrophin releasing hormone actually. And then that signals the adrenocorticotropic hormone to enter the blood. And then those high levels are oftentimes detected by the adrenal glands. And when those levels are high enough, then our adrenal glands naturally have to release cortisol. So that's how that works. And like I said, there are cortisol receptors in most of our cells. And so as you can see, like this has its own cascading effect in the presence of insulin or not. And the release of cortisol in and of itself, even without the intake of food, okay, will inherently have an effect on your insulin levels. So when people don't understand the relationship between stress, prolonged stress, cortisol elevation, and belly fat, this is how that happens. So when we have cortisol levels that are far too high, insulin becomes inhibited, and it naturally increases that belly fat because that blood sugar has no place to go. It's just me floating around. So next, we have estrogen. So estrogen is, secondary sex hormone. Men and women both produce it, primarily in women. There are 4 different types of estrogen that are available in our body. Premenopausal, that's estrone, estradiol, estriol, and estetrol. And those are really important hormones that we have, keep in balance to one another, and maintain a homeostasis with another hormone called progesterone. And I'm going to talk about the relationship between estrogen and progesterone in just a moment. But estrogen's, it's really got a lot of responsibilities outside of our reproductive matters. It obviously helps with menstruation, it helps with pregnancy, all of those things. It plays a role through the transition period of menopause and is still present in a much smaller amount postmenopausally. It helps with memory, it helps with muscle and bone development, okay? It also helps our body store fat storage through the hips and thighs, and that's in part thanks to estradiol. Now, women who make a transition through menopause will oftentimes see that the fat that they had in their hips and thighs migrates to their midsection. And it's not so much of a migration of sorts, I would say, as it's much that we just don't need to store our fat through our hips and our thighs anymore, and the presence of estradiol isn't as great anymore. So therefore, the fat storage will not be there in as great of amounts. But in just a few minutes, I'm going to talk about the relationship between menopause, estrogen, as well as the development of more of a midsection in women that might not have otherwise had it before menopause. Now, I mentioned that the relationship to progesterone to estrogen is very important. And oftentimes what happens in women premenopausally is that they have a higher estrogen to progesterone ratio. And this is not to say that women have high estrogen levels necessarily. It's just that the estrogen to progesterone levels are affected. And this is oftentimes affected by diet. It can be affected by stress levels, but it can be very much affected by diet. So when you have a higher estrogen to progesterone level, these should be sitting in homeostasis. Your body's flooded with estrogens. And when this happens, our bodies naturally want to store weight through the hips and thighs. So when we experience this level of higher estrogen to the level of progesterone, we develop more of a pear-shaped body. So very oftentimes, you know, and this is exclusively for women, that when women develop this body shape, and we'll talk more about body shapes in just a moment, oftentimes it's very much affected by diet. And so you might be wondering, well, what can you do with your diet to affect that? And we'll get to that in just a moment. But now let's talk about our thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormones are, I can't say enough about them. I think we all know how important thyroid is to us. Thyroids regulate our resting metabolic rate, or our basal metabolic rate, however you like to say it. It affects growth, neural cell development. And usually what we find is higher levels of the hormone T3 and T4, and also free T3 and free T4 in a normal thyroid have an increased RMR. So higher levels of those hormones, higher levels of what's considered normal. So quote unquote normal. So when you go into the doctor and you have your blood test done, and you'll see that there's a norm given for every blood level, right? What we find and what research has shown is that people who have a higher level of T3 and T4, higher level meaning a higher on the normal level, have an increased resting metabolic rate. And I'm going to talk about why that's important very soon. And then conversely, people who have lower levels, but still be considered in the normal range, have a decreased metabolic rate, decreased resting metabolic rate, and are subjected to regain of weight post-dieting. So I wanna pause here for just a moment and really emphasize this. So this goes to crash dieting and major caloric restriction. So the studies that I've read related to this have indicated that people with lower levels of T3 and T4 on the norm, after they crash diet, they regain very quickly. They rebound in that weight gain. And, you know, this is all like, what is normal, really? You know, this is where it comes into like, what's normal, what's not normal. It's not necessarily that you have a quote unquote slow thyroid or something like that. It could just be that you're on the lower end of normal, and that you are going to be more, you're going to be more open to that post-dieting weight gain, which is undesirable for a number of reasons. One, it's frustrating on a personal level too, right? It's really takes away motivation, but also it's very unhealthy, and it places a lot of stress on our body. And unless it's under medical supervision, or unless you really know what you're doing, there is no good reason to simply just cut calories for the sake of short-term weight loss. So then finally, the lower levels of T3 and T4 also, though, are correlated to fluctuations in your insulin and your cortisol levels. So here we go again, right? We're talking about insulin and cortisol and thyroid, and we know that, you know, all of these, there's a lot of interplay between all of these hormones, you know. So thyroid is one of those hormones that we don't necessarily need to bend our brain over too much. Our body is our body. We can affect it a lot, though, by eating appropriately. One thing that I like to remind people of, though, and I don't have it on the slide, is you have something called a thyroid stimulating hormone, and that works kind of like a thermostat. So when and it's located in the anterior pituitary gland in your brain, and when you have a need for more T3 or T4, when it starts running on the low side, it's again like a thermostat where your thyroid stimulating hormone is released, and it signals to the thyroid gland to increase the amount of T3 and T4. So that's something, you know, that we can really keep in mind, that our body does a pretty good job of regulating this hormone on its own. It's just good not to mess with our hormones by crash dieting and things like that, because that can have a direct effect on our hormones. So let's talk about a couple of really interesting hormones that have a lot of interplay together, and they are leptin and ghrelin. So leptin's made in our fat cells, and it has satiety properties. So leptin is found in our subcutaneous fat, and ghrelin stimulates appetite, and it's made in our GI tract. It's also made in the lining of some parts of our small intestine as well. This is the thing that's very interesting about ghrelin and leptin, and the relationship between the two, is that ghrelin was only isolated as a hormone in 1999. It was identified back in the 1960s, I believe, but it was only isolated in terms of its role and what it does in 1999, which makes a little bit more sense now, when we didn't know what fat hormones were doing, or not our fat hormones, but what our fat cells were doing. When we used to think that fat would just sit there, we now know that they are metabolically active. And we know that leptin is available in our fat cells. So it sounds kind of counterintuitive that leptin is the hormone that's telling us, hey, push the table away, and ghrelin's the one telling us, I am so hungry right now, I could eat anything. But that's where they're located, and that's how they work. Leptin and ghrelin, the relationship is overstimulated in overweight and obese people versus normal weight people. So here we have this vicious circle, right? We have a vicious circle of an overstimulation of leptin and ghrelin, which inherently then, especially if your ghrelin is overactivated, would increase hunger. You still have the production of leptin, but not necessarily in the same amounts. But if you have an overproduction of ghrelin, you're going to be hungrier than your counterpart who is of a normal weight. What's more, if you or if one of your clients or one of your patients is already overweight, their metabolic needs, their energy requirements for their size, to maintain their size, is going to be greater than what it would be for somebody that did not have as much stress on their body. So these are things to really consider, and you know, the role and the interplay between these hormones. Leptin and ghrelin, when we start talking about body shape and things like that, won't necessarily be discussed in great detail, but if you have any questions about them, I'm happy to try to answer them for you as best as I can. Finally, let's move on to growth hormone. And like leptin and ghrelin, I'm not going to be diving into this one too much as well when we talk about body shape, but I feel I would be remiss if I didn't talk about it because it is so incredibly important. I write about this subject an awful lot, and I think I can't stress this one enough. So growth hormone is secreted from our pituitary gland. And it's responsible for growth, it's responsible for muscle development, it's responsible for metabolism. It increases when we sleep. It also increases with stress. It increases a little bit with exercise as well, but it really increases when we sleep. So every sleep cycle, the recommendation is 7 to 8 hours. And I realize that there have been recent studies that suggest that some people do just fine on a lot less sleep. And it turns out that those people have a bit of a genetic anomaly that allows them to get by on less sleep. But for the average person that doesn't have that gene that's saying, hey, you can do better on less sleep, from the average person, the recommendation is still to go through 7 to 8 hours of sleep, or about 5 sleep cycles. Each sleep cycle is about 90 minutes long. And on the front end of that sleep cycle, our pituitary gland releases a copious amount of growth hormone. And that growth hormone is especially released in the first sleep cycle. Okay, so you have 5 sleep cycles, and a majority of it is released in that first sleep cycle. And then amounts of growth hormone are also released in the 2nd through 5th cycle as well. And it's just, I can't stress how important this is to you if you are someone that is concerned about maintaining muscle mass, if you're someone that's concerned about resting and digesting. You know, we've heard this term a lot too. If you're concerned about maintaining a healthy metabolism, about maintaining healthy brain function, all of these things come into play when you can maintain a reasonable amount of growth hormone naturally through getting a good amount of sleep. Now, higher insulin levels, here we go again with the other hormones that are playing with hormones. Higher insulin levels inhibit the release of growth hormone even during sleep. So here's an example of when this would happen. Let's say that it is 10 o'clock at night and you just got home from a play, or what will be a play soon once we're all out of our COVID-19. And you just got home from a play and it's 10 p.m. You didn't have a chance to really eat a good dinner. So now you're hungry, and you're really hungry. So you're gonna sit down and you're gonna have a big, I don't know, burger or a slice of pizza. Should we go extreme again and just say something really that we know is not good for us? You're gonna eat something, or you're gonna have a bowl of ice cream. And you're gonna eat this food, and what's gonna happen? Now we know what insulin does, right? So our blood sugar levels are gonna go up, whether it's ice cream, whether it's a piece of pizza, whether it's even, let's say, a pound of carrots. Our blood sugar levels will naturally go up. And then in relation to that, insulin has to go up as well. Now, if you have food in your gut that needs to still be digested, and your body needs to still maintain itself through the release of insulin so that blood sugar can get into the cells, so they can get absorbed into the cells, glucose gets absorbed, the body will not release growth hormone. So you kind of get shortchanged there if you eat too closely to bedtime. So I'm not telling you if you go to a play, you arrive home late at night, you should not eat at all if you're very, very hungry. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is that eat something that is going to be on the lighter side, and that will give you a big helping hand. But also don't eat foods that are going to be terribly heavy within 3 hours of going to bed, because if you do that, it takes about 3 hours at the very least for food to work its way out of, let's say a meal to work its way out of your stomach specifically. And if it's going to be sitting there overnight and your metabolism naturally goes into a bit of a rest period as you sleep, well, then what's going to happen? You know, you're going to wake up, you could be hungrier in the morning thanks to the insulin that went to work. You are also going to probably feel less well rested because you didn't have the release of growth hormone, and you're going to have a gut that might still be partially full of food that probably shouldn't be there. So one big tip would be just be careful and cautious of what you're eating right before you go to bed, because you can really give yourself a hand if you eat lighter before you do go to bed if you need to, or just stop 3 hours or so before you go to bed. Of course, if you have some sort of a metabolic concern like diabetes or something like that, well, then you have special considerations and you need to do what's right for your body. Speaking of bodies, why don't we jump into this? Let's talk a little bit about body types. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Belly Burn Plan, and it was based around some research, a lot of research that I did on hormonal balancing, and also the interesting phenomenon that not everybody has the same body shape, and that some people almost exclusively gained weight through their belly area, giving them an apple shape, while other people could eat very similar diets and then gain weight through their hips and their thighs while having a very defined waistline. And then there were other people that I noticed that they were maybe shorter, had really broad shoulders, carried a lot of weight through their upper body, through the upper torso, had more upper body obesity. And then there were people that just kind of carried their weight everywhere and had more of a voluptuous hourglass figure. All of these shapes, with the exception of the apple shape to some extent, all of these shapes are great. I mean, our bodies are our bodies, and we need to really embrace our shape as much as we can and do the best that we can for our body to get our body shape back to healthy if it is out of alignment with what our health is for our body. So those are the 4 shapes. We got the apple, we got the pear, we got the inverted triangle, and the hourglass. So let's just talk a little bit about the apple type. I mentioned earlier that excessive insulin production, or even the fatigue or the inability for the body to create, the fatigue of the pancreas to create that insulin, leads to the apple type body, and that's where you store fat largely through the belly area. And this body type is very much a combination of visceral and subcutaneous fat. And going back to the beginning of the slideshow, you know how dangerous visceral fat can be for your body, all of the effects that it has on your body, from provoking inflammation, leading to long-term low-grade inflammation, the stress it places on your vital organs, all of that. We don't need it, but if you have it, it doesn't matter if you're 18 years old, it doesn't matter if you're 88 years old. If you have visceral fat, it's dangerous, it's dangerous, it's dangerous, and it's a good idea to move it. You know, you're likely, this body type typically, because the fat tends to migrate to this part, this person typically has leaner legs and arms. This is not just a woman, as you see here. This can also affect men very easily. And the hormone that's mostly at play here is, of course, insulin. Now, I said that there was some good news earlier on when I was talking about visceral fat. And the good news is that visceral fat does not want to be on your body. It doesn't want to be there. Your body wants to be healthy. And visceral fat, you know, any measurement over 10% of our body fat from visceral fat is too much. And people who have an obvious amount of visceral fat usually have way more than 10%. And that's not to say that 10% is healthy, but 10% is kind of like that marker that is the red flag. Well, if you have more than 10%, then, you know, really need to kind of focus on correcting that as much as possible. How do you correct that? You correct that with diet, but again, and lifestyle changes. But going back to this again, visceral fat doesn't want to be there. Okay, so if you currently have an apple shape, if you have clients or patients that have apple shapes, this fat should and will move off their body quite readily. And the way that you do that is and this is a very general idea of a diet for an apple type. Usually an apple type does better with higher amounts of protein. And this would make sense because we need to control blood sugar levels with an apple-shaped body. And you can't do that on a very high carbohydrate diet. Especially, I should say a refined carbohydrate diet. Doesn't work. Have a moderate amount of healthy fats. Half or fewer of the calories should be from carbohydrates. And that, to some people, especially if you've gone the keto route, half or fewer calories should come from carbs, you may be shaking your head going, wow, that's a lot. That's so many grams of carbohydrates. But the type of carbohydrates that I am talking about when I work with my clients, they're they're unrefined carbohydrates, mostly vegetables, some fruits, and you know, a consideration for grains. It really depends on a lot of things. And we're going to talk about the motivating factors if you're working with clients in just a bit. But eating 3 regular meals a day and having healthy snacks to normalize and stabilize blood sugar levels. So these 3 meals a day is going to be key, right? Because if you're already carrying a lot of weight through your midsection, if you are, if you notice that hunger is a problem, you're hungry throughout the day, there could be a blood sugar imbalance. There probably is. And so the key there is to really stabilize that as much as possible. And there's been some research to show that caffeine can provoke that as well. And that again would make sense, because what does caffeine do? What can caffeine do? It can trigger cortisol. So we know that cortisol and insulin, there's interplay there. And if we're elevating our cortisol levels, even if the coffee, let's say, that you're drinking is black and calorie-free, it doesn't matter, because the caffeine can have an effect on your body and can certainly have an effect on your cortisol levels and increase a latent amount of stress. And if you're already experiencing a high amount of stress and you're noticing that your diet's not changing, but you're gaining more fat through the belly area, this could be a reason why. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the pear-shaped body. Now, this person, again, almost exclusively a woman, stores fat through her hips and thighs and possibly through the lower belly area. And we're talking below the belly button. You probably have a healthier hip to waist ratio, which is desirable. So it's probably 0.85 or less. And I can provide some calculations for that later on if it's useful. But fat storage through the hips and thighs is considered subcutaneous, so it's inherently less dangerous for you. I realize that it is unsightly and a lot of people don't enjoy having, especially if it's a predominance of fat through the hips and thighs. It's something that is just something that is provoked by the hormone estrogen. Now let's remember that estrogen and progesterone need to sit in homeostasis with one another. And if your estrogen to progesterone levels are too high, then fat storage is really easy through the hips and thighs. So now we look at diet. What can we do for diet to try to bring that down? We know that fiber can help to eliminate estrogens through waste, through elimination. So the recommendation for a pear type diet would be to eat a diet that's higher in complex fiber-filled carbohydrates that eliminate excess estrogens. Just pull them out of your body. It's not quite that simple, but if you could visualize that, wouldn't it be lovely if all of the things that we didn't need were moved out of our body that way? But it is certainly an effective way to help this body shape. A moderate amount of protein and a lower in fat. Low fat or no dairy. And I mean this like low fat dairy or no fat, no dairy at all. Dairy can be, especially if it's not organic, not from grass-fed animals that you know are grass-fed, know your farmer, right? If it's not from these sources, it can be very hormonal. And the last thing that we need is to introduce additional hormones into our bodies and provoke this body type even more. Again, avoid caffeine, alcohol, parabens, phthalates, and glyphosate. Certainly eliminate glyphosate. Any of these, not necessarily caffeine as much, and I'll get back to that in just a moment, but certainly the others can increase estrogens in our body and contribute to that. Now, glyphosate especially, please, I mean, be on the lookout for this chemical. It is in so many foods that are not organic and or that are GMO, certainly. So, you know, keep an eye open for foods that are not non-GMO or that are not non-GMO, and it will give you a helping hand. So that's almost a surefire way to try to eliminate most of that. I know it's in a lot of different things, but do your best there. And this will greatly help out the pear-shaped body. Moving to the inverted pyramid. Now, this is an interesting type because this person usually carries a lot of, and this is not, again, not exclusively a woman, but this person typically has a lot of upper body obesity. And the relationship here is to cortisol. And when cortisol levels are increased, we know that blood pressure increases, and that for reasons that are not completely understood in the research that I've gone through, is that fat tends to carry itself through the upper bodies, through the arms, through the back, through the chest. If you're a woman, you might notice it more around your brow line. Men might get more barrel chested, and then the upper belly area tends to be affected. Women tend to be, the typical type would be, women tend to be really muscular, like stronger looking, have more musculature, certainly be of that mesomorph or maybe even endomorph body type, where they are just a broader skeleton. So again, with that, I'm just talking about the skeleton. And then have a stockier build. And again, this type, we look at the hormone cortisol in a way to try to reduce it. And one way to do that would be to just really balance things out, really watch the amount of stress, watch the amount of salty foods, fatty red meats, and caffeine. Salty foods and fatty red meats. Why? You know, what is it about those two that, why do we need to really put up the yield sign when it comes to those foods? One of the reasons is not necessarily that these less salty foods or fatty red meats do something to the body inherently that would contribute to the fat. It's that when our cortisol levels are increased, everything constricts. Our blood vessels constrict, our arteries, our veins constrict. You know, we have an increase in blood pressure, and salty foods and fatty red meats can actually exacerbate that. So it's more of something that we really need to be aware of and cut back on. And I've had great success with people who've come back on salty foods, fatty red meats, and even cut out caffeine, because again, we're talking about cortisol. So naturally, caffeine comes into play here. And if you are a big caffeine person and you're shaking your head right now, you're not alone. I do have a couple of things I have to say about that that will maybe make you smile at the very end of this. But just wrapping things up on the inverted pyramid here, you know, complex carbohydrates, always going to be good, providing energy, lean proteins, healthy fats, especially the monounsaturated type, okay? Because we need heart health here for this type, especially if it's someone who's had prolonged or exaggerated cortisol release. This is something we need to watch out for. And then the hourglass. So the hourglass would be something, you know, like we naturally, like when there's a lot of fat distribution throughout the entire body, this is a person that has, if you're a woman, you probably have more of a voluptuous figure. If you're a man, you have weight that's distributed throughout your body. You see this a lot in the face. Distinguishing factors would be you gain it in the face, you see it in your face, you might have it in your wrists, you might have it around the knees, maybe the ankles, but places where fat typically doesn't first go on, you'll notice that you've gained weight everywhere. And yeah, I mean, this can absolutely happen. Now, what's going on here? Well, you've got a lot of hormones that are at play. I have insulin, ghrelin, and leptin and all of these, but you know, starting with the thyroid hormone, you know, thyroid goes into action, and then you know, we've got different effects going on with our thyroid that are promoting fat storage, especially, you know, through various parts of our body. And then we've got insulin, which is again having that effect on cortisol. We've got ghrelin and we've got leptin that are speaking to one another, but ghrelin is especially active. And then, like I said, once we get into that vicious cycle of fat storage and fat storage, and then there's an accumulation of fat storage, it becomes that vicious cycle of ghrelin saying go all the time, saying go to food. And leptin is kind of that voice that maybe doesn't get heard as much. And so, you know, again, you know, the hallmark figures of this would be someone that carries a lot of weight through their face, through their wrists, their hands, etc. But also, like, it's an interplay of a lot of different hormones, which would make sense because it's affecting a lot of different parts of our body. So we need a lot of evenness here with this type of person. And meals should be larger in the morning and smaller toward the evening. You know, definitely wanting to make sure that the belly isn't totally full before they go to bed, making sure they're eating on the lighter side, so that way, you know, insulin does not need to go into play just before bedtime, and that there's certainly a good amount of blood stability or blood sugar stability throughout the morning time with starting with a larger meal. All meals should include plenty of vegetables, very lean protein, and be a little bit lower on the fat side as well, because we have multiple hormones that are at play here being key factors. Again, you know, anytime you affect one hormone, you inherently affect all hormones to some extent. These are the key factors that if we can control these factors, if we can control the thyroid, if we can control insulin, if we can control ghrelin and leptin, at least try to get ghrelin and leptin back on track. Again, ghrelin and leptin is kind of sitting on the sidelines, but it's making us hungry, or it's telling us to push the table away. So if we can get these hormones back on track, it is going to help our body shed that unwanted fat, especially, you know, where we're talking earlier on through the midsection, which is most dangerous. Okay, so coming into the last few minutes, let's start wrapping things up a little bit here with menopause, hormones, and weight gain. So when we go into menopause, our estrogen levels begin to drop. And if you are someone, and I know I've had clients that have gone through this long before a typical transition into menopause, but if estrogen levels drop, then they will entirely, if you have a hysterectomy, especially if your ovaries are removed, and then progesterone and testosterone, excuse me, also drop. This affects the muscle mass. This affects your fat storage inherently. And now, just as a marker, the average woman gains approximately 10 pounds through the menopause transition, and that transition is roughly 4 years long, okay? So muscle mass is going to be affected through the role of testosterone being decreased. You know, estrogen, you may not gain weight. You may not gain weight. You may not jump on the scale and see, hey, I've put on 10 pounds, but you'll notice that the fat migration has moved more to the north because of, because there is an increase or a decrease in insulin sensitivity. And so you are going to be more susceptible to blood sugar fluctuations, which inherently store fat through the midsection. And this is something, then once you start storing fat through the midsection, then that increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, and all of these other things start falling into place here. And this is where, we really need to get our arms around the hormones that are triggering this and controlling it as much as possible. Because for a woman that's postmenopausal, granted the hormones may be more stable, but that fluctuations of hormones of estrogen, the drop of progesterone, the drop of testosterone, almost eliminating estrogen entirely. There's a lot going on with your body, and so you just have to be patient, be graceful with what's going on, and try to understand exactly what's happening. But menopause, fat storage, and diet. So diminished estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone naturally affect your lipid metabolism. Okay, all three of those. So you're not breaking down fat like you were before. Fat, like I said earlier, fat migrates to the belly area due to a decrease in insulin sensitivity, and as a byproduct of that, you're naturally more at risk for heart disease and diabetes. Now, if you discover that you are more sensitive to insulin, you need to shift your diet. So it doesn't matter where you were before, what your body looked like before. You need to start eating foods that are going to help you balance your blood sugar levels better and maintain more homeostasis through all your hormones, especially your insulin. So that way you're not allowing that migration of fat to sit through the midsection of your body. If you are menopausal or postmenopausal, it's not necessarily a rite of passage. There's a lot you can do about it. And you can certainly mitigate factors that would otherwise contribute to heart disease and diabetes as well. So there's a lot that we really can control. So beneficial foods would mimic an apple-shaped body, include lean protein, fibrous vegetables, some but not too much fruit, and healthy fat. Okay, so just quickly rounding things out here, let's talk a little bit about body shape, lifestyle, and motivation. So what you can do to understand the hormones that might be at play with your body, take measurements. It's so much better than getting on a scale. Get a tape measure, take measurements, measure your belly area at its natural waistline. Take a measurement of your hips, or have your clients do this. And if you wish, the arm, the thigh, the breast area could also be helpful, but especially the waist to hip ratio is so critical and so important to knowing where risk factors might be for major disease and where especially visceral fat needs to be lost. And I hone on this because a majority of people, this is where the problem is. Weight gain history. If you were working with a client or a patient, or if it's you yourself, what has gone on in the past? Has the thyroid been kind of messed with a little bit? Have you crash dieted in the past? Have you gone through a cycle of diets over the last couple of years? Have you done macro cycling? Have you done, different things? And then what's the weight gain? What's the weight gain history? So, are you someone that's have you recently gained a lot of weight and lost weight? Are you prone to going back and forth? You know, these are all useful facts to have in your back pocket when you're considering, you know, the best way to work with a client. Lifestyle, you know, what are the pre-existing conditions? Is there a physician referral? Is there anything that's contraindicated? You know, this is a good thing to know before you start, obviously, understanding this. Activity and exercise history. What's this person doing? If they're really not sitting around doing anything but saying they're active, then, you know, that could be a way to maybe motivate your client into getting some purposeful activity. What's the career? You know, are they an attorney working 80 hours a week? Are they a doctor working 80 hours a week? Or are they someone that has a less stressful career? And then, of course, what is that stress level? What's the family relationship like? You know, like, what are the expectations in the kitchen? Is this somebody that's responsible for making food? Is this the person that's just receiving it? So there's a lot of things that go into play here. And then, of course, what's the knowledge of nutrition? So these are all the things that are good points to kind of jot down when you're working with someone to get an understanding of getting a good baseline. And then motivation. This is understated. I mean, this is something that I don't think that practitioners work on enough with their clients, but you can't force feed somebody something that's in a box and expect people to just follow it. But whether or not lifestyle is where it needs to be, how willing is a person to improve their life? So I always say approach with patience and try to meet your client or your patient, or be with yourself where you are right now and accept this is where you are, and you can grow from there and you can work from there, and it's a wonderful thing. What I do with my clients, I grade my clients from an A to an F, and I take motivation into factor. I factor in, you know, how, you know, what their family circumstances are, and A to F, an A necessary is going to be someone that is going to be, let's say, extremely compliant, like they're almost there. And then an F would be somebody that maybe doesn't have their act together yet, but both could be very motivated. So it would be what their biometrics are, how far they have to go, what their motivation level is, you know, what availability they have to fresh food, nutrition, things like that. And then, of course, what their knowledge is of nutrition. All of these things I take into account, and then I kind of grade my clients before we begin. So if it's somebody that really has a long way to go, they might be on the lower end of the scale, but then they could, you know, it's easier to work with someone when they're going from like that F to a B, because it's so easy to motivate someone to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and just encourage them with a lot of good information to get them to get up to that spot where they see real progress, and they notice it in the way that their body responds. And also, you know, really be prepared to take the long view, whether it's for you and your own personal journey or for your clients. You know, there's no overnight fix. It shouldn't be a lose weight quick approach. All right, so that's really the end of my presentation. Got a lot of information in there, Paula, and I'm just kind of showing this little slide here to keep in touch with me. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I know that some of you may have questions right now that can't wait to hear, but my email is Traci with an I at tracidmitchell.com. You can also find a lot of articles that I've written at tracidmitchell.com, very original, my website right there. You can also connect with me on social. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, and my kids got me on TikTok, so that's interesting. But I've also got a LinkedIn account, so if you'd like to connect for professional reasons, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you.
What did you say your kids got you on?
TikTok. I kid you not.
I see.
I'm making recipes, and I'm making like healthy recipes, and I'm doing these under 60-second TikToks, and they're reaching young people, you know, and they're interested. And like, it's worth it. As soon as I started seeing the comments, that it was worth it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Good for your kids. We can learn. We can learn. All right, we've got some good questions. Fabulous information. It's just so full. We could take many sections of it and keep diving in deeper. So let's see where we get with the questions. How do we know how much visceral fat that we have?
That's a good question. Earlier on, I was talking about the protein, the retinol binding protein 4 when we were talking about visceral fat. I know now that there is some research being done into creating tests that measure for that protein specifically, so we know how much visceral fat we have because there's a way to quantify that apparently. I've not been involved in any of that research, but in the research that I've done, I see that that's a possibility. Right now you can do scans. So you can actually, and I suppose if you are in the realm of morbid obesity, which would be considered 40% plus fat, then or more, then your physician may recommend that you go in for a scan. But you can get a scan of your body that will show you definitively how much of your body is visceral fat, and you'll find that obviously through your midsection exclusively, and then you'll know there. You know, if you're not someone that is carrying a lot of visceral fat, but you maybe have like belly fat you need to lose, you know what I mean? Like, you know that it's a visceral fat and you want to get healthier, you want to change your diet, use a measuring tape. And it's really one of the best things that you can do. It's the cheapest thing you can do. Measure your waist and through your natural waistline under your clothes without compressing the tape too much. Measure your hips. And then, you know, you can just Google this. It's very easy to find. There's a calculator online. There are probably hundreds of them. Waist to hip ratio calculator. And look for that. And that will give you an indicator of whether or not you're in a healthy range or not. It has nothing to do with body weight. It has to do with your waist to hip ratio.
Great feedback, really great. And I'm glad that you took it. It's like, if you want to spend money, if you want to go in for a medical evaluation on this versus use a tape measure. I love it. Can we have a combination of body types?
Yeah, you can. Well, I get that question a lot from people. You're probably an hourglass if you have a combination of body types, because that's kind of what's going on, is the multiple body types that are there. Sometimes what happens with women, especially like when they're going through a transition through menopause and their bodies are migrating from that hip and thigh fat that naturally sits there. Again, that fat literally, it's not literally not moving north. It's just that, like I said earlier, we have decreased insulin sensitivity, and that's blood sugar fluctuations. There's an instance there where over the course of a couple of years, you might have that. You could have that perimenopausally potentially too. But no, I would say like it's very unusual to see somebody that's, you can't be an apple and a pear type. You can't be an apple and a pear type. You would be more of like this hourglass. And I have to stress here, it can be kind of misleading because hourglass doesn't necessarily mean that you have a defined waist. I say voluptuous, like you have a lot of curves, but you still have visceral fat. You may still have hip and thigh fat for sure, and you could still carry weight through other parts of your body just as easily.
So are you also indicating that body types can change?
Well, it definitely, from a pair, if you're a pair and let's say you're a pair in your 30s and you're not through menopause, you just inherently lose some of the fat. You're not going to lose all your fat through your bottom or through your thighs, but because estrogen levels drop so dramatically through menopause and postmenopausally, the fat that would normally be stored there for reproductive purposes through the hips and the thighs is no longer necessary, so it doesn't get stored there anymore. So it diminishes a little bit, but oftentimes what happens with women when they go through menopause is they notice their bodies change, but they don't notice that a change on the scale. And again, this can be attributed to a lack of testosterone, that our bodies are not able to make muscle as readily as they were before. And there could also be like an exchange of hands between muscle for fat.
Thank you. Another question we talked about thin people and the percentage of body fat. So thin people might have a higher percent of body fat than lean muscle, but still be considered thin or underweight even. Normal or underweight. And so you talk about having skinny fat, right? And so people would naturally think that, I mean, this is the assumption in our society, is that if you're thin, you're healthy, that you're not, that you don't have too much body fat. But is that a misunderstanding?
Yes. So there are some people whose bodies just, we all know that person that you can eat whatever you want. She can eat, or he can eat whatever he wants, and he doesn't seem to gain a pound. You see this typical in young people, especially, but you see this in some people, and these are anomalies, but you may see this in people periodically throughout your life, that they just have a leaner disposition or look like they're leaner. The word I prefer to use when I talk to my clients is lean. I don't like to say skinny, I don't like to say fat. But in the case of this, it's definitely important to recognize that you can be skinny, you can be very lean, and you can not have the musculature to support your skeleton the way that it needs to be. You could be eating foods that don't mineralize your bones. You can absolutely have a much higher body fat than somebody. You could have two people standing side by side, both of them, for argument's sake, let's just say they're both 130 pounds and 5'8", which I think we would all agree is a fairly lean body type. It could be very different sizes. You could have somebody that could be, a size, several sizes larger or inches larger in different areas, and still contain in their body, still have a preponderance more body fat than the person that is of leaner muscle mass. So you can, it's not just can you, it's an absolute yes. I mean, we all have different biometrics, but if you're someone that doesn't like to exercise, that doesn't do, has no activity, that doesn't follow a really healthy diet, you're most certainly going to have a greater body fat than your neighbor that may have more purposeful exercise and eats a very healthy diet, just inherently.
There's a follow-up on this saying that she's post-menopausal, low activity, office desk job, chronic insomnia, challenge to gain weight, and is on a whole foods omnivorous diet. Any thoughts about this for her?
So you said challenge to gain weight. Did I hear that right?
Yes, challenge to gain weight. Yes. So she would be that. She would be ostensibly higher body fat and ratio to lean muscle.
Oh, I see. So higher body fat to muscle. Well, okay, so going back to a couple of the points, one of the things that, well, there are a lot of unknown factors here, but let's just put out a few general rules. Obviously, start with the top that everybody knows. Caffeine consumption can inhibit sleep, right? I mean, if you have problems sleeping, and if you're not sleeping properly, then you won't have the growth hormone release that you otherwise necessarily need to be able to allow your body to rest and digest, but also to develop muscle. If there's, I took down some notes as you were writing this, but I think you said works in an office.
Yes.
Like,
finding low activity, very.
Yes, job. Sedentary activity level is what we're talking about.
Yes.
So, obviously, like my advice would be to find a way to support this person to find some purposeful activity. It doesn't have to be going to the gym to work out, of course not these days. It doesn't have to be running a marathon, but doing anything that would increase activity level, even if it's 2 10-minute walks per day, just so that this person can actually have the release of some testosterone, right? Can balance blood sugar levels better, can have a positive effect. I mean, just the endorphins that are released just from activity could be beneficial as well. And, not that a 20-minute walk cumulatively would ever contribute to great fatigue, but I've worked with plenty of people that just want to get around the block, so it really depends on where this person is and, where they want to be. But if it's to reduce body fat, obviously focus on, look at how many refined carbohydrates you're eating, omnivorous diet. So, just really watch. I mean, if it's omnivorous, just watch the quality of the foods that you're eating, watch the amount of refined carbohydrates you're eating, how many processed foods are you eating, what can you do to get away from like the sneaky foods that might get into your diet, like having too much sugar in your coffee drink, for example, in the morning, or tea, or whatever it might be. Watch for those little small things that can otherwise really have an impact on your body and your life.
She says, thank you, this is doable. That's good.
Good. But you're getting these in real time. I love it. Okay.
Right.
Great.
All right, some question about the different body types, and you were talking about combinations of foods and to have more certain macronutrients in different ones. Have you ever taken that and put it into macronutrient percentages? Does that help somebody to be able to understand it better? Somebody would say should have 40% protein and 40% carbohydrate, 20% fat, something like that. Is that more understandable than saying have most of your calories from protein
Yes.
and carbs and less from fat?
Yes, it is. And I actually have that in my book, but I didn't, I should have done that. I have that in my book, the rough percentages. So within like 5% or so of one or the other, it does help people a lot to understand. If they're of that mind frame where as long as they're not going to be every day measuring their macronutrients and driving themselves crazy to the point where it's no longer sustainable. What I also do that helps people a lot is I will demonstrate with plates. So like this is what generally what your plate should look like. And
Yeah.
on this, like, so your plate should look like for an apple type. This is what your plate should look like. This is what it should be void of. But yes, to answer your question, yes, it does help to give those percentages. And it's actually a lot easier and a lot less mind-boggling than giving them calories. Because
Right.
calories don't really do much help, but giving them percentages does help. Yes.
And percentages with a visual works, right?
Yes.
Because it's like percentages, right? Like, oh, well
Yeah.
done on that. So follow up on the original question with this is increasing activity level for the higher body fat to lean muscle will increase testosterone. So this question is, are there natural ways to get testosterone after menopause to help with body composition?
Yeah, so exercise is going to be one of the best ways to do that. And again, like we women, we go through a lot when we go through so much. Like we go through so much with our reproductive hormones, and where men kind of have this nice steady state, we have this roller coaster, and then when testosterone diminishes. So yeah, I mean, an easy way to give a modest boost. This isn't going to be no panacea effect, but you can increase your testosterone. And I would need to look this up to give you the correct answer, but I believe I am correct in saying that sleep can also help. So let's say that you're someone that has a problem sleeping. Sleep can help just naturally because it helps your body rest and digest. You help to develop the muscle in your body. So if you've done any purposeful activity throughout the day, and let's say you have micro tears in your muscle tissue, your body has to repair that tissue, and it does it best at night. And so the exercise that you've done, if you've modestly increased your testosterone, that's one end of the day, and then growth hormone on the other end of the day when you're sleeping. Again, you actually release growth hormone when you're exercising too, which is a good thing, but you get a preponderance of it at night when you're sleeping. So I would say it's more of a combination of like those two things that really work together. And to just, other than that, I don't know off the top of my head any safe way to increase testosterone levels other than looking at cofactors that could inhibit the production of testosterone, which would actually be, an increase in visceral fat can do that. And so just be careful, and, the more visceral fat that you can take off of your body specifically, the easier it's going to be for that type of production.
Great, thank you. We're talking about, I think it was the inverted body type and avoiding salty foods, refined foods, and fatty red meats. Is there salty foods? Is that referring mostly to processed foods or just poor quality salt? Is there a difference between poor quality salt and healthy salt in the foods that would be chosen here?
So of course we need some amount of sodium in our diet naturally because our body chemistry relies on it. But yes, Paula, to answer your question, or to answer the person's question, absolutely. Certainly we find a lot of sodium. The quality of sodium is really important because if you're using a really nice Himalayan sea salt and you're putting it into a broth or something like that, that's great. If you are reaching for a bag of chips, that's what we're talking about. So it's just that when people with elevated cortisol levels sometimes have these cravings for salty foods, and I think it has something to do with like the elevated cortisol levels. And then it reaches a tipping point where you have to supply the body then with sodium, and there are diseases like Addison's disease, Cushing's disease, that are functional diseases related to cortisol production, but aren't anything we're talking about right now. But so sodium does. So processed foods that would otherwise be rich in sodium in that sense. So canned soups, chips. You want to watch out for, just read your labels and see how much sodium is in something. Even condiments can be very high in sodium. If you're adding it, salt is a lot like sugar, where we have a tolerance for X amount of sodium. And so we can also you're sensitive or you're decreased sensitivity to sugar, which is not a good thing. You can have a decreased sensitivity to sodium to some extent too, although that's not as common. Just make sure you're keeping your sodium in check and getting it from the most unrefined ways possible, and probably just adding it into your diet rather than just getting it from a processed food.
Thank you for that too. There's just a few more questions. Coming back to sleep cycle, the first sleep cycle is how long? So on average, how long is the first sleep cycle?
The average sleep cycle is 90 minutes long. You go through all of your waves in your sleep cycle. So it's in the front part of your sleep cycle. So the first part of the 90-minute sleep cycle, and this may be a little different for everyone, but it's always the front part of your first sleep cycle is when you release the copious amount of growth hormone. And so they're 90 minutes long, and you go through roughly 5 of those sleep cycles. It would be ideal if they were all uninterrupted. I know that's not possible, especially if you're a young mom, if you're a mom, period, if you're a caregiver, if you have a career that you can't get sleep like that. You do the best that you can. But yes, so 5 sleep cycles. Each sleep cycle is roughly 90 minutes long.
So leads to the question then is, could falling asleep on the couch and then going to bed hinder this? So like she falls asleep at 10 on the couch and then go to bed 10:30 or 11.
So naturally you're interrupting that sleep cycle. I would say yes. And for me, the money is always going to be in that first sleep cycle. If you cannot fall asleep I'm guessing in front of the TV or something like that on the couch, try to make it to bed so that you're getting that sleep cycle. And it's different for everyone. I'm not sure if you're well rested or not when you're falling asleep in front of the TV, but it could lead to a better night of sleep where you feel more well rested in the morning. And you should, especially if you're sleeping through that first sleep cycle. It may take a day or two to notice, but it really does have an effect on your body.
Okay. All right. This question refers to she's wanting to keep functional muscle on. So how good is the benefit of whole foods, plant-based nutrition compared to other diets postmenopausal?
So is that a vegan? Are you saying vegan or plant-based, or are you
whole plant-based? Didn't say vegan. Whole plant-based nutrition. So plant-based could have, it didn't say all plants. It said plant-based, and to me that's confers combination.
Okay.
Of macronutrients.
I would say I think that's ideal, right? I mean, that's what we want. We want to be mostly plant-based, no processed, very minimal processed foods. I mean, we're all human postmenopausally compared to other diets. So I don't know what other diets this person might be referring to, but oftentimes like I hear people jumping onto like a keto diet or something like that, or weight loss usually, or something or other.
Yeah.
If it's for medical purposes, that's one thing, but I would say a whole foods diet is always going to be your best diet, period. And it's the least processed.
And then following your body type for the amounts of macronutrients for it.
Yes, roughly. Yes. And that's not to say calories, because everyone's going to have different caloric needs. So, if you're more active, you're going to need more. If you're not, you need less. But you're going to follow those general macronutrient percentages, those amounts. Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, this is a longer question, and it's almost case study. You up for that?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. So a little bit of a backstory here. A couple of years ago, this woman's life changed dramatically when she found out that her body does not manufacture lipase at all, and then started taking lipase and shifted her diet to the keto diet, and was able to get off 10 medications that had been treating a multiple of conditions like celiac and GERD and fibromyalgia, Lyme and chronic fatigue, and severe allergies and occasional mood disorders. She lost over 100 pounds and was doing great, felt more energy and life than she had since childhood, and was on a modified Mediterranean diet. But got bit by a Lone Star tick, contracted alpha-gal syndrome, and now has anaphylactic response to all mammalian meat and dairy. So that makes supplementing and allergy treatment really problematic because of the fillers and binders and gelatin and corn, etc., that are in less than high quality supplementations, I'd say. And then, so that's making her food choices really so limited now. And so she's struggling to maintain a healthy diet. She's put back on 40 of those pounds, 30 of them since COVID. She's 59, postmenopausal, and situationally frustrated and saddened, bordering on feeling sorry for herself. So her question comes down to, how can she eat a balanced diet with all of the many limitations? How can she jumpstart her metabolism at her age and take off the pandemic poundage and continue her road to better health?
Okay. Wow. I am so sorry that that all of this has been happening. So I assume this person is taking a like an enzyme for the lipase, and then she mentioned medications. I'm not sure what's if there are more medications or other medications, but it's still really nice to be off of 10 medications. That's a huge coup. So something was going right there. And it's nice that she discovered what it was that she was intolerant to. But then you've got celiac disease on top of it, GERD. But let's look at the things that she's in control of. So she gained 30 of the 40 pounds back over COVID, which is, I have to say, I hear a lot of people gaining weight back over COVID, and it's not uncommon. And we're all dealing with a lot of very unusual stress in the best way that we can. So we have that. There's control factor 1. Control factor 2 is she's postmenopausal. So she's got steadier hormones than if she were going through a transition right now into menopause, which is nice. Mm-hmm. This is a beneficial thing. So there are 2 factors that she can control. So if she put the weight on over COVID, that's probably related to something about the way that she was eating, I'm guessing, if that weight came on that quickly. So if there's a way to undo, try to identify, what I like to do is tell people to identify the top 3 habits that you allowed to ingrain in your lifestyle over COVID, and try to undo those, whatever those habits are. Try to get out of the cycle of doing those, whatever it might be. It's hard to say because there's so many different factors at play here. Okay, so she can't have any mammalian byproducts, and it sounds like a Mediterranean diet was working okay. I think that going back to some semblance of that might be beneficial without the byproducts, without the mammalian byproducts. And it certainly makes sense that, she can't go on any sort of supplements or anything, especially if they're made with gelatin or what have you. And not all of that is high quality too, to your point, Paula. So, I would start with identifying whatever, habits that kicked in through COVID, try to identify 3 of them, and, undo whatever those 3 habits might be. Recognize that you are postmenopausal already, which means that you have more stable hormones. So you can do a lot to control in blood sugar levels that won't be as wonky anymore as if you were going through the transition. So you're kind of on a level playing field right now, at least in terms of menopause. So try to, control those factors as much as you can. And then, I don't know how much help this would be, but then going over and taking taking a good look at the landscape of the Mediterranean diet and imagining it without any of those animal byproducts in them, without any mammalian byproducts in them, because you know, that it sounds like that worked and that could be really beneficial for her. And then also, you know, it sounds like she's got some autoimmune concerns going on there. So perhaps, you know, there will be a time when she can reintroduce some things again, and be free of all this. But right now, her body needs to go through a state of healing, and you know, it sounds like she needs to. She probably is under, you know, medical care of some sort, and so you know, she needs to stick with the program, whatever she's doing.
Right. I would hope that she's seeing a competent healthcare practitioner, that she gets on quality supplements that are not disadvantaging her, and that she gets support around the line, because the tick is what provoked the undoing of this. And so, yeah, having professional support around that would be beneficial, I would think. Okay.
I agree.
I think that brings us to the end of the questions. It's fabulous. Really, I love Q&A because it brings in so much more of the information and takes it to another level. So thank you for that. And I just have a few closing comments, everybody, and then we'll close for the evening. I want to remind you that the webinar was recorded and it'll be available on Hawthorn's website under archived webinars in just a few days. There's a survey that we're asking you to fill out right as the webinar ends, and it certainly helps us to have your feedback and any comments about this presentation especially, and I really appreciate you taking the time for that. Our next webinar is going to be on September 21st with Julia Ross. She's the best-selling author of The Mood Cure, The Diet Cure, and she's going to be presenting on nutritional first aid during COVID-19 crisis, overcoming depression and stress-induced food cravings with targeted amino acid therapy. And our next All About Alumni graduate interview is Wednesday, September 2nd at 12 noon Pacific time with our Master of Science in Health and Nutrition educator graduate, Laura Kopek. She'll be presenting on her postgraduate activities and accomplishments and challenges. I'd certainly tune in for this one. She's been doing some fabulous work, and we have many previous terrific grad interview presentations too, so please check out our archives and don't miss Traci D Mitchell in there. She had a great one. This concludes our presentation for today. I'm grateful that you showed up and stayed for all of this fabulous information. I'm always grateful to James Bernardinelli, who's the engineer for these webinars. Thank you, James. And thanks again, Traci, so much for this really power-packed presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for joining and having this educational experience together with us. I wish you all the best of health. I certainly look forward to learning more together at Hawthorn's webinars and our All About Alumni series. And until then, I'm going to pay attention to my hormones because it matters here. I hope you do too. Meet me back here in a couple of weeks, everybody. Thank you so much.